My name is Angelina Avedano, and this is Interspace, where we explore the spaces between us. Join me for discussions on a series of realities with thinkers, writers, thought leaders, and artists. Hello, everybody. I want to talk to you about and introduce you to Interspace, a discussion forum that will be brought to you in a series of podcasts that I hope you'll enjoy. I want you to know what it'll be and why I'm here and who I am and what I'm about. So, my name is Angelina Avedano. Welcome to Interspace. And I hope that you will enjoy these conversations that I've been having with folks over the course of my life, but mainly in the last few years, I've really been paying attention to what people have had to say and their experiences and the stories that they tell about their own personal growth and transformation. Those are the conversations that interest me. They're the ones that inspire me. They're the ones that make me want to get up in the morning and continue to work on my own process of growth and hopefully to inspire my students and anyone that I come in contact with to work on their own growth. And I think that is why we're here. I think it's what makes life exciting and a learning process for all of us. So why Interspace? Why a podcast? Well, I just thought I want to bring those conversations to life. I love creating the space in which those conversations unfold, and I learn from them every time. So I hope you feel the same way. And that's what Interspace is about. And what I'm about is I'm really discovering the foundation of what I want everything in my life to be about, whether I'm in the classroom teaching or the virtual classroom these days, whether I am leading a workshop, whether I am supporting a friend, whether I'm participating in a group or a workshop. I want my presence to really center on three things, which is connection, inspiration, and transformation. Those are the conversations that I'm interested in. They're the ones that I'm about. And so as I think about those three things, connection, inspiration, and transformation, it seems that everything that interests me falls into one of those categories, and they certainly overlap for me in many ways. And I think that you would feel the same way. And how this all started to come together for me was a couple of years ago. I had an encounter on a trip that I decided to take after I finished my PhD work, and I took a train trip across the country just to see what that would be like, and to write what I thought would be write a book on the train. That doesn't really work the way that I thought it would, the romanticized version of it in the movies, like I would write my book on the train. First of all, there's no Wi-Fi on the train when you're in the middle of Texas and out in the middle of nowhere. So there was no ability to write, and I'm not, although I like to think of myself a bit old school, writing by hand, and I know many people do it, but writing everything out by hand, I do not know how authors did it. I get sore and tired typing, so, but I need my creature comforts, and I did do some writing, and I did do some exploring and research, but what ended up happening was I started having conversations, and I started paying attention to them. And when I thought that I was research, or what I thought was going to happen in that my journey across the American Southwest on the train, to be an author curled up in her seat writing, turned into really just listening to people and paying attention to how serendipity and synchronicity and connection happened in a really fun and unexpected way. And during that trip, I was looking for the kind of this the place that I could ground the book that I was working on at the time. And I haven't finished that book yet because another book ended up happening, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But I was looking, I thought I was going to find this thing. I thought I was going to search for this and discover this moment or this encounter in a very specific way of what I was looking for. And at the time I was looking for Green Man. And I won't get into all the details of what the Green Man means to me or why I'm going to write about it. But what I will say is that the Green Man showed up, just not in the way that I thought the Green Man would look. And I happened to be sitting in a garden. I was very fortunate to have a friend invite me to stay in her beautiful home in Southern California. And I was sitting in her garden and trying to write and be all introspective, and taking myself very seriously, and trying to create this moment for myself. And this cicada bumbling around in the garden was making all this racket. And there was this beautiful bird and a beautiful tree and a wonderful garden, and it was all sculpted and lovely. And this cicada, this bug, was knocking into these orange trees, bumbling around the hedges, and making this loud buzzing like a B-52 bomber. And I thought, you know, everything is perfect here except for this cicada that is messing up the whole scene. And I'm trying to write, and I'm being very quiet, and the cicada will not go away. And so I decide, well, maybe I should pay attention to the cicada. Like, what is it here to tell me? This seems ridiculous to me. I'm not really looking for insects, so how is that going to inspire me in this moment? But who knows? Okay, so I'm writing in my journal. I'm trying to reflect a little bit. And I start researching on the internet about the cicada, just to see what was happening in that moment. And wouldn't you know that this whole world opened up to me as I started researching the cicada. And so, what did I find out about the cicada? Well, I found out that, first of all, the name of the cicada, like the genus name or the species name, I don't even know how. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. I don't know. But is magi cicada, or magicada. You could say it any number of ways, but I love the magi cicada. Because I'm thinking of the magician. I'm like, oh, well, that's really cool, the magi cicada. And then I read that the magi cicada lives under the ground in a completely different life, in a completely different form called the nymph, for 17 years. 17 years it spends under the ground, eating from the roots of trees. Now, some cicadas, I did learn there's many different names, but of course this is the one that I gravitated to with the magi cicada. But there's others. Some live under the ground for 13 years. Some live under the ground for less. But they do go through this period of time as a nymph, living under the ground, eating from the roots of trees. And it's not like other animals that are in stasis or hibernating, or it is in an entirely different lifetime under the ground as another creature. So I really started to think about that. Wow, what is up with the cicada? And then I learned that when it goes from, as I'm reading about it, just do a Wikipedia search. That's all, that's all I was doing at the time, just to try to see what was going on, what was speaking to me. But when it comes up and emerges out of the ground as the nymph, and some of you may know the sound of the cicada in the trees. I mean, I grew up with that sound of the cicadas in the trees in the Midwest. I know the sound well. But it had a whole life before it ever came up to make that sound. And when it comes up out of the earth and it emerges and it gets rid of this like shell, you'll see those little crunchy shells like on the like still grasping on the trees. Some folks call those locusts, but this is a cicada. I think there is a similar insect, the locust, but like I said, this is not my field. I just went to what was speaking to me. But when it comes to that stage of its life where it leaves the nymph stage and emerges, it's now called the Imago. Now, all of this, the Imago, the image, all of this has so much meaning for me as a cultural mythologist, as a contemporary mythologist. And that is my field of study. That's what my PhD is in. And so here I have this insect now speaking this language about magi and nymph and imago, which has this whole psychological meaning. I did some reading by Susan Isaacs, and she talks about the unconscious image is this imago. We think of the imago as an unconscious image, so as a mythic kind of image. And it means any object or situation, human or otherwise. So it's really a life image. Here is showing up in this name of this creature that emerges out of the ground and now is the Imago. Well, that definitely had my attention. And as you might know, then the cicadas, once they emerge out of the ground, they climb the trees. But first they go through this, like you can search this on YouTube and see the videos of how they break out of the carapace, how they break out of this shell of their former lives. And then they just arch their backs and they lean backwards and they throw that off, they worm their way out of it. It's almost like a birth process. Obviously, it seems laborious and not even really all that graceful in the moment that they're breaking out of the shell. But once the shell is gone, they lean back. They have to dry. Their wings start to unfold, and they have these kind of lacy-looking, filigree, beautiful wings. And it's just this amazing process to watch, this metamorphosis of the cicada. And then, after they dry, and their wings are dry, and they can move, then they climb the trees, and they climb to the top. The males, in particular, climb to the top, and they start to sing this song. The shrilling is what it's called, this shrilling song, to then call the females and reproduce. And just this whole image of the breaking out of one way of life, a whole life under the ground, so to speak, and then this freedom, this birthing process, and the singing. And what this stage is called is the imaginal stage. This is amazing to me, the imaginal stage. And so here we have this whole language of mythology happening in the cicada that showed up bumbling around in an orange tree in a garden, which seemed to be the one thing out of place. And it was the one thing that spoke so deeply to me that I couldn't even stop thinking about it. I was obsessed with the cicadas from that moment on. And the more I read about it, the more I knew that insect was just a lifelong message for me in my own life. I really started to resonate with that song. And I think that's what living mythically is about. And that's why I'm a contemporary mythologist. That's why I was led and just gravitated to mythological studies from the beginning of my education. When my first class that when I took at a community college was religious studies, was like an intro to world religions. Because I thought, if I'm going to go to school, I had raised a family I had my sons were teenagers at the time, and I thought, if I'm going to go to college and study something, I really want to study something that I'm interested in. I'm not really going to become a CEO of a company. I just really want to learn things that I'm interested in. So, the first class, Intro to World Religions. I was completely intimidated by being an older woman stepping into a college class. Now I am the college professor, and I have those experiences with students as well, who are coming back, who are maybe have raised a family later on in their life. And that is always one of my favorite moments. I love all of my students, but I in particular resonate with those students who feel so out of place coming back and with all these young people, and it just seems like, how am I going to have anything to contribute, and will anyone take me seriously? And what I know now is that the students that have the variety of students in a class, whether it's a virtual class or whether it's a face-to-face class, the variety of life experience is what actually enriches the class and makes it better. You don't want everyone to be the same. You don't want everyone to be the same age or have a similar life experience, because it gets so rich and so deep to have those conversations amongst all different kinds of people. So that's what I love about my job as a professor at the community college nearby here at Massasoit Community College. So I'm really, really thankful to have that experience in my life. So I'm talking about the cicada and what it meant for me, and it just spoke so loudly that I began to envision a business, a website, a platform for creativity and inspiration and connection and transformation. And it all came together in this cicada, the image of the cicada. And so I played with the name, and I came up with a name that I like, using a Y, cicada. And it just really has helped me to, excuse me, it really has helped me to identify for myself what it is that I'm here to do in the world, and in this moment in time. And, that might change, but for me right now, this is my work in the world. And I had been playing with creativity and a course, not a course, but a workshop that I put together called Feed the Muse. Also very deeply rooted in mythology and stories, and really helping folks at work or in the workplace or in their lives to connect with their creative energy, to focus on that and prioritize it. Because what I had found in my own life, in writing and whatever it was that I was doing, if I was able to prioritize my creative life, my writing, my music, whatever it was that was kind of in the forefront for me in that moment. I've been a musician. I am a musician. I've done a lot of singing. I've done a lot of writing. I've written music. I've written poetry. But creativity shows up in so many different ways, and certainly as the mother of three sons, when they were younger, there was a lot of creativity that we were exploring all the time. So creativity is a huge part of my life. But I also went through those periods of time, like we all do, where we say, I'm too busy and I don't have time. I don't have time to be writing or pursuing this foolish endeavor. I need to get serious about making money, or I need to pay the bills, but what I found out is, even in my busiest times, the more creative I was, the more engaged with my creative life, the more energy I had. So if I was staying up all night, really jacked into some kind of creative energy or flow that was coming through, and I wanted to write. This happened to me. I can remember one instance in particular around 2006, I want to say. I was writing a play. And the energy was just coming through so strong. I couldn't sleep, and I'd just stay up all night, and I would be writing, and I would just be furiously typing out the scenes that were coming through. And I wasn't tired at school the next day. I was deep into finishing up my undergrad program as a double major in religion and English at that time. I had some great mentors that intervened and said, you need to be doing both of these things. And but what I found was that if I just let myself experience that creative energy and let it through in the moment that it came, rather than saying, you know what, I really need to sleep right now because I have class in the morning, or I have work in the morning and I will be too tired. If I just let it happen when it happened, the next day I wasn't dragging or tired. I was on my game. And so that is what inspired me to create a workshop, Feed the Muse, that would help people to see that it isn't the last thing on our priority list. I truly believe that creativity is going to be the salvation of the human race. It is the one thing that sets us apart, creativity and innovation. And if we don't prioritize that, we're just drones. And there are so many stories and myths and images and artistic expressions of this very thing. And I have myself gotten caught up and believed the lie that I don't have time, or that it's not worthy or valid, even if I'm just doing it for myself, that it's somehow a silly thing to do. I don't know where those messages came from, honestly. But I somehow internalized them and bought into them, maybe created them, obviously created them and believed them. But what I know now is that if I just allow myself to create freely and get out of the way, because that's really what it's mostly about, is getting out of the way, I am joyful. I am more alive. I am fulfilled. I walk taller. I feel like myself. I feel like myself in such a beautiful and sacred way. I mean, that's when we're the closest to our real core selves, what we're really here, what we're about. And so anyway, that is how I wanted to bring that kind of a message in a workshop wherever I was, and so I put one together, and I needed a sort of like platform or an umbrella to put that under, and so I created CycADA Personal Metamorphosis as a place for where people could access me, connect with me, and my workshops. And I have writing workshops and memoir workshops, and I'm doing some work with seniors as well around writing and memory and conversations, and I think also mentoring others in their own creative exploration and personal discovery is what I find one of the most rewarding things that I can offer. Is just to hold that space and be with other individuals as they discover that process for themselves and really validate it for themselves and give themselves permission to connect and to be inspired and to grow and to transform, or to find themselves transformed and to experience transformation. And transformation does not happen first of all, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen alone. Although there are long periods of solitude, I can definitely attest to that. But transformation is also can be very painful and very uncomfortable. And without the support of others in my life, I don't know how I would have gone through that. For me, there's been a lot of ways that I've experienced loss and moments that have brought me really into a point of crisis, or a point of having to let go of the old way of thinking about myself and thinking about my life. We all experience these. It happens in our childhoods, when things don't go as we had planned, and when we lose our innocence, whether it's through parents or other people in our lives that are close to us, brothers and sisters. We all experience a loss of innocence, a loss of the idealized version of what life should be. And we experience those losses as a tremendous grief. They start in childhood, and maybe some of us even carry them. Some people believe from other lives. I really don't know. I don't know about that. But I can say that over the course of my life, we call that baggage. We can carry that with us. But I truly think that my exploration of religion and mythology and stories, and my need to understand them and to find meaning in them, helped me to find meaning in the chaos of my own life. And there were many, like I was saying, there are many losses. They start in childhood, and then we grow up and we experience them in lots of different ways. We get married, we get divorced, we lose some aspect of our health. We go through these very difficult periods of our lives. We lose a job, we lose our faith. These grief encounters really are the catalyst. What I would say is the catalyst of transformation. And it is my work as a cultural mythologist and a contemporary mythologist that really helped me to start to make sense of my own loss and grief in my life. I didn't realize that was probably what drove me to study these things for such a long period of time, for over a decade, and now I continue to do that work with even more excitement and enthusiasm than ever. I think as I get older, I really truly appreciate the ability of stories, in whatever form, whether they come in sacred text, whether they come in myths, whether they come in fairy tales, whether they come in great works of fiction or accounts of history, or people telling their own stories, sharing them with one another. It doesn't really matter. Stories are the way that we make meaning in our lives. And I have found that to be one of the most beautiful and inspiring discoveries in my journey as a contemporary mythologist. So that desire, I think, to make sense of the senseless, to understand, it's the kind of cliche to say, why bad things happen to good people, to understand the tragedies of life, I don't know if it's some would say that's just a foolish endeavor, right? The opiate of the masses, religion, that, maybe it's just a coping mechanism that we just need to make meaning, so we do, and we ascribe meaning, and therefore we feel better. Maybe. Is there something wrong with feeling better? Is there something wrong with making meaning? I personally find living my life in that way, paying attention to the connections and the meaning and the insects that come to me, and really taking in the information and exploring what that might be saying, or what wisdom is there. I think that's what makes living mythically such an exciting thing. It's much easier to do that in a garden with an insect on a beautiful day. It's less easy to do that, and it's much harder to find meaning in senseless tragedy that we see everywhere in our lives, particularly today. I know a lot of people are suffering with COVID and losing their jobs and losing loved ones and losing their health and long-lasting effects on many different levels of isolation and symptoms. And so I think that the current crisis points that are colliding in our world today, I was going to say the nation, but I think it's even bigger than that if you start to think about the environment and the global calamity that we are facing. If we aren't really attentive to the stories from the past, we're missing an opportunity to learn and to find something meaningful in the midst of what could be a dystopian, nihilistic future. How did this show up for me? It wasn't easy. It was my experience with my son, who is now in his 30s, and his schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. I often say schizophrenia because it's easier for people to understand, but the truth is that schizoaffective disorder is a combination of schizophrenia and those symptoms along with a number of other things, but for my son it is bipolar disorder. So the ups and downs of mania and depression along with the symptoms of schizophrenia combine to create a very volatile mental state, schizoaffective disorder. I'm not really here to talk about him, but what I had to learn for myself as his mother. And not only has my relationship with my son been one of the most challenging and painful experiences, filled with grief and loss and unbelievable frustration, when you consider the mental health system and the court system that continues to fail families over and over and over again, and there's no good answers, no one to blame, just this senseless illness, this senseless situation that you find yourself in, where you have no control whatsoever. And this immense grief was the major grief event in my life that sort of catalyzed all of the other experiences that I had and made me look at them in a different way. And how that happened, it was a long period of time. Of course, with my son in his 30s now, there was a long period of time where I was trying to control everything, where it created a lot of havoc in our lives for the entire family, and there was a lot of loss and grief and effects on everyone that I couldn't control, and my other sons as well. So that was it was a very painful experience, and I think anyone who loves someone with mental illness knows what I'm talking about when I say that it's not a grief that the grief and the loss, it's not the same as losing a child once, although I would say that is something it goes on and on as well. But what I want to clarify is that there would be this cycle of hope that things would get better. Like that maybe this time things would get better. I think when you have this like loss is or grief is in death, you know there's a finality to that. I think the ongoing nature of it is that will the pain ever end? Will I ever be able to um, uh, experience life and love again for in whatever way that loss or grief comes to you or despair comes to you? And it can be, like I said, it can be the loss of a kind of family group, like a church, and your relationship with your church breaks down. I went through one of those experiences, and it was very, very painful, very much like a divorce, something that makes you rethink everything about what you believe about yourself and others and your faith. And so it can show up in many different ways. And the loss of a loved one, a child, a brother, a sister, a mother and father, it happens. But there's a finality to it. There's not a finality to the feeling and the emotion and the loss that you feel. But the event doesn't give you hope that that person is going to come back, or that it's going to be something other than what it is. And that's what I mean. That's just the one differentiating factor here I want to say about mental illness. So those of you who have experienced this, loving someone with a mental illness or some sort of behavioral disorder or instability, know maybe it's addiction. You know what I mean when you just keep going through you go around and around the cycle again and again, and you experience the loss and the devastation, and then you think, well, but maybe this time it's going to be better. Maybe this time, this program and this plan is going to work, and we have everything set up. And look, they're taking their meds, and things are looking up, and I think things are going to be okay. And then you start to see the signs, or maybe you deny the signs, but the signs are there, and you find yourself spiraling into this once again, into the chaos and the loss and the grief. And this cycle for me happened many times with my son. And there were many, many months and close to years when I didn't know where he was. He would be off the grid. He'd live off and on the street, which is what he preferred. So he said that he preferred. And it was really coming to terms with my own experience, not his experience, but mine. And so I started to write in a moment when I felt this grief most profoundly, which was 2.5 years ago when I saw my son for the first time in 6 years. How did I not see my son for 6 years? Well, it happened when he called me and he'd gotten himself a one-way ticket to Honolulu. And I was in such a state of shock that how could this even happen? I could tell you a whole story about how he had support services, and he had structures in place that he had his own apartment, and he was doing well. Again, there was that cycle where I thought, oh, here we go. Things are good. I'm hopeful that he's going to have a normal life, that maybe everything's going to be okay this time, only to get this phone call where he had somehow managed to gather up all his money and get a one-way ticket without any money once he got there, and my inability to get to him. He called, and then there was no more phone, no calls, and I had no idea where he was on the island. And if that wasn't, having my son off of the continent, off of the landmass, for me, really brought me to a point of complete breakdown. I didn't have any control over anything. And this was just a completely senseless situation. Complete chaos. I was trying to move forward in my life. I was in a grad school program. I was trying to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And just the devastating reality that I was in made daily life almost impossible. The worry, the nightmares, the dreams, the guilt, it was almost intolerable. And fortunately, I had, how the universe works, or whatever you want to call it, serendipity, or, whatever it is, but it had put me in a path where I was studying mythology and stories. And I was surrounded by people who knew how to make sense of grief and loss and trauma in a mythological way. And, then I can start to piece together my life and say, oh, all these things sort of were working together for me to come to this place, this deep crisis, personal crisis that challenged everything that I believed about being a mother, what it meant to have a good relationship with my son, what it meant to have a good relationship with his brothers and my other sons, how to continue, how to live life and not completely self-destruct out of mourning, that somehow if I go on with my life, am I betraying my son? Am I somehow, would sacrificing my own mental health somehow benefit the situation? Of course not. But as a mother and as someone who loves someone with mental illness, I'm sure many of you can identify with that. You will do absolutely anything. And the pain is enormous when you cannot control someone else's decisions and you're watching them hurt themselves. And sometimes maybe they don't feel like they're hurting themselves, but you feel like they're hurting themselves, and that is very painful. That's creating your suffering. And what I mean by that is, in this moment that I saw my son after 6 years, after his his one-way plane ticket to Honolulu, and the time went by, and he was on the street for a time, then he'd be in jail for a time for loitering or for jaywalking or for, shoplifting. And then they would put him in the hospital for a time. And the cycle would go around and around and around. And with no real resolution, with no solution, with no wisdom or even any answers. So I found myself in Honolulu through a course of events. Again, a synchronicity that brought me there through a lot of in a really unusual way. And when I saw him, it was so difficult to see him in such a disassociated state, such a dysregulated state. And I didn't know what to expect. And I didn't know how to react. And the only thing that I could do was to start writing. And so I have finished that book. And it's called Living Grief. It'll be coming out in January. And it was the only way that I could make sense. And I started to use these stories, the stories that I had been studying, the stories that always spoke to me in the classes and the coursework that I was doing at the time. Like I said, it's as if everything brought me to this point where I could have a language and have a foundation to begin to put the pieces of my life back together when everything fell apart. And so I'm so thankful for that. I had spent so many years when my son was young and we first got the diagnosis early on. Of course, these diagnoses in children, they evolve. I always knew there was going to be something with my son. I didn't know what it was. But once puberty hit, he was diagnosed as bipolar. And I started to read everything and try to make sense of it at the time. It was many years ago. And it was just devastating to read about what that was going to mean for us. And I refused to believe any of it. I just didn't want to believe that. I didn't want to buy into that. And then even more so later, as it became clear, when my son was in his early 20s and late teens, 19, 20, about the time that it is typical that symptoms of schizophrenia start to surface and manifest. I did a lot of reading. I wanted to make sense of it. I wanted to redefine it and reimagine what was happening to my son in lots of different ways. I think it's part of why I was on the course of study that I was. Why I've been interested in shamanism and mythology. I think oftentimes people who have sacred gifts could be diagnosed, and we don't have a society that allows individuals with different kinds of gifts a way to use them. We pathologize it, we medicate it. I have a lot of mixed feelings about this. I wanted it to be something else. I didn't want it to be schizoaffective disorder. I didn't want it to be bipolar disorder. I didn't want it to be a pathology. I wanted it to be a gift. And I still think that that's true, but it's really not mine to figure out. And that is what this crisis point revealed to me. It really wasn't mine to figure out. There's nothing that I can do to figure that out or to make that path open up for my son. All I can do is continue to do my own work and to explore my own journey. And it was this moment, one of the most profound realizations that happened at this time was I had told myself all these stories about how terrible my son's life was, living off and on the street, how awful it was in the hospital, and how poorly they were treating him. And I had created this story in my head based on, I don't know, movies, my worst fears, and in those visits with my son over the course of the 6 weeks that I was in Hawaii, and I was able to see him, it became very clear to me that his experience was not the story that I had been telling myself. And it was a real awakening moment for me, that how much I had suffered and what I had created in my own mind. And then maybe I believed that if I suffered like that, somehow it was doing some good. I honestly don't know, but I spent a lot of time struggling against a reality that I had created. And that's what I learned. That was the most profound lesson I learned in those conversations with my son, that in many ways his version of his story was not all that traumatic. I mean, I'm sure there were things that were traumatic for him, but they weren't the way that I saw it. And that was very telling. It showed me that I didn't know what was going on. I didn't have control of anything, and I was creating things that didn't exist, and I wasn't even aware of things that did. So what on earth was I spending all my time doing? And how was I going to move forward? So what became in this story, or what became of my conversations with and my son, and listening to his story and really investigating my own story, was my own deep dive into grief and despair, and how it became a catalyst for my own transformation, and how my story was my story and his story was his story, And while they overlapped and they sort of did this dance together, we were two separate people, and I had to let him go and live out his story in a way that he chose to do that, even in this state that he was in, because to do otherwise was to go against everything that I had actually come to find out was true, and to validate the stories and to validate his unique presence in this world, and also how much this event and this relationship had guided my own journey and my life, and how much I had benefited and become the person I was because of this tremendous pain. And so while it was the huge source of grief and loss and suffering, it brought me the most awareness and, in the end, the ability to experience fulfillment and joy and honesty and connection and inspiration and transformation. So it was like, how is that possible? How could this be? And then I started listening to other people's stories, and I started to look at the grief stories in myths and sacred texts, and you can see that that is the pattern. It is it's the crucifixion story and resurrection story. It is it shows up in any number of ways. And so that's the work that I love to do, to look at those stories, to look at the myths, whether they're Greek myths, whether they're Christian stories, whether they're Sumerian myths. And it is fascinating to see how human resilience and shows up, and how transformation reveals itself in nature and in the stories that we tell, the stories that we gravitate toward. You'll hear in the course of the podcasts ahead, for instance, I talk about this kind of transformation experience, or this potential with Dr. Jaffa Vernon Frank. You'll hear us talk about that and what she calls and talks about in her own book as post-traumatic growth. She is an incredible mentor and friend, and a very educated and wise woman who helps me often to contextualize trauma and grief and loss through her own experience, but also her knowledge. It is what this potential for transforming loss is what led me to create a workshop around that, which I'm running currently, and will continue to do so as it will pair with my book as it comes out at the beginning of the year. So that workshop is called Transforming Loss, and it looks at stories, and it shows the patterns in the stories that go from, what happens in the grief process, what happens in the catalyzing event, how are we stripped down, and then how do we reemerge, how do we reimagine ourselves and find restoration. Those stories are out there. They're there for us. And those of you who have experienced some kind of trauma or loss in your life, and you've moved through that, or in your process of moving through that, you know exactly what I'm talking about the benefits, about the beauty that doesn't disregard the pain, but is aware, fully aware, and not completely identified with only the loss and the pain, but also the growth and the emergent wisdom and beauty that comes out of these experiences. So that too is a part of Cicada, as I'm working to build this these offerings under that umbrella, and Interspace being one is just a kind of a mode of communication to you about the conversations that I'm having that have sustained me through that process, and that hopefully will also inspire you to embrace and lean into that. I know that's an overused term, but I'm going to use it anyway, to really just embrace and move into that process as it's happening. That's the only way, honestly, to do it. However, you can't necessarily do anything to make that happen more easily or quicker. And if it weren't for my own personal teacher, you'll hear a conversation between us as well. My personal mentor and teacher, Tom Carr, who has taught me meditation and also helped me to work through, I've been working with him for 8 years, and to help me through a series of emotions around loss and grief and motherhood, and also, but to experience all of the aspects of my life, everything from early childhood on, without judgment, and my own reactions to it. And that has been a really beautiful and validating experience, that I started to understand that it is just becoming aware of them without the judgment and the guilt that really allowed me to release so much of the desire to suffer and the identification with pain and loss in my life. That doesn't mean that the pain and loss isn't there, but I just recognize it now as something that is a cycle. It's not something that defines my entire life, and that took a long time. I'm in my 50s now, so it was not an easy process, but it was without the pain and suffering, even that I had created for myself, I wouldn't have come to the place that I am today. I am fully convinced of that. So I just want to say one thing before I go, that the blessings that come out of these traumas, these grief events, the losses that we experience on any number of levels. We might even think of them as sillier, that they're not even all that, they're not such a big deal. Why are we overreacting to them? Loss is loss. Grief is grief. Despair comes and it goes. And there is no, one is greater than the other. If you're experiencing it, it's there. But also there's the potential for those blessings of connection and inspiration and transformation. They are in that field, and they've come to me. They've revealed themselves to me in so many different ways, through the synchronicities, through encounters, extraordinary encounters with nature, through intimate and real conversations with people on the train, with people who have supported me, mentors, through stories. And I hope that Interspace can capture some of those conversations, some of those moments, and inspire you so that you will recognize them and embrace them in your own life. In fact, I would love to hear about them. So you'll be hearing more from me, and thank you so much for listening. You have been listening to Interspace with Angelina Avedano. My heartfelt gratitude and appreciation goes to my husband, David Needs, Senior Production Engineer. If you would like to learn more about me or my work, look for me on Facebook and Instagram, Dr. A. Avedano, with CycADA Personal Metamorphosis. That's Cicada with a Y, CYCADA. Or you can email me at dr.aavedano@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This is Angelina reminding you that we're all connected.